Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi!
Hello friends. The video I did on the best abilities in the game has been my most popular video to date, racking up over 40,000 views since June of last year. A lot has changed in the game since then, so I thought it was about time for an update. I want to give a quick shout out to Aarons, Tawan, and Hito Nagashi, who have all helped with insights and bits of this script. In this video I'll be working through the recommendations by Grand Alliance, namely where to spend your Imperial, Xenos, and Chaos badges. However, I'm also breaking my recommendations down into different stages of the game. Whether you're a new player, mid-game player, or an endgame player, there is a section for you, with character abilities for the most relevant modes highlighted. Let's take a quick look at the maths and resources required for some of this expenditure to understand why it's important to plan ahead. The maximum level in Tacticus at the moment is level 50. Abilities become more powerful in a non-linear fashion as you level up, but so too does the cost of leveling those abilities themselves. Taking an ability from level 35 to 50 costs you 64 legendary badges, 700,000 gold, and about 2.3 million experience. Compare that to the cost of leveling an ability from level 1 to 35, which is simply a fraction, only 200,000 experience and 123,000 gold. It can be costly, literally, to invest in abilities that have little long-term value. I've tried to be as lean as possible with my recommendations by only highlighting what I consider to be the best abilities for each stage of the game. It's also worth pointing out that I've just focused on traditional characters without exploring machines of war. We'll start by taking a look at the beginner player and the options that they have available. One of the most common mistakes that I see with new players is not realizing how scarce some of these resources can be over the course of a game, and over-investing in some of the starter characters. At time of recording, the game essentially has a predetermined list of starter characters that all new players start with after completing the tutorial and opening some pre-scripted requisitions. You then also earn character shards for playing certain game modes. Through opening your first 10 scripted requisition pulls and some early campaign progress, your opening pool of characters expands further. As a result, you'll have this initial characters to work with. You'll also have a single random character pulled as part of your scripted 10 pull. I'm not going to include them in this list because, well, they're random, but if you're lucky and pull one of the mid or end game characters here, then definitely pivot your investment. The question here is, which of these abilities should you invest in to get through this stage of the game that will also hold their value in the mid to late game? For the skills on this list, I would suggest bringing them to level 26 before stopping for this stage of the game. For your Imperial badges, I would recommend going all in on Bellator. Bellator's active is probably the most useful ability in the early stages of the game, and his summons will allow you to defeat a lot of the early campaign missions easily. What you're banking on here is that the enemy AI prioritizes killing summons over your own main characters, so this lets you skimp on investing into non-valuable characters. Your initial lineup of available Imperial characters is not very impressive, so for the secondary Imperial investment, I would put badges into Bellator's passive. This increases the character's overall damage output, and Bellator and his summons remain very useful in the later stages of the game. For Xenos badges, I would recommend the passive ability of, well, come on, everyone say it out loud with me, Eldryon. My past self has explained many times why Eldryon's passive, Doom, makes him the best non-legendary character in the game. For secondary Xenos investment, I would put badges into Aleph Null's active. As is the case for Bellator, we again bet on summons carrying you through the campaign. Be mindful of the self-imposed ceiling we set earlier. I would stop leveling this ability at around level 26 or so because it falls off in later stages of the game. For Chaos badges, the summoner trend continues, this time in the form of the active for Abraxas. He is unlocked using the starter Eldari trio of Calandis, Aethana, and Eldryon in the same hand campaign. Abraxas is the best Chaos character to get you through the initial campaigns while holding his value in the mid to late game. As a secondary investment, I would suggest putting some early badges into Angrax's passive ability. While not directly useful for completing campaigns at this stage, the passive is one that you'll eventually want well into the high 30s or low 40s as you progress through the game. I've summarized these recommendations on this slide, which we will keep updated as we progress through the phases of the game. What about characters not on this short recommended list? Well, it's your game to play as you choose, but generally I wouldn't recommend bringing their abilities past level 12 or 13 just now. You can always circle back and level these abilities up later on, but campaign progress, which is probably the main focus point for early game players, is generally dictated more by gear levels rather than ability levels. Arena is probably the other main reward avenue for early game players. Abilities don't factor that much into success here. The strategy for this is pretty simple. Use the characters that you have the most investment in and simply let the enemy run towards you. Getting that first turn of big attacks in is the main thing that you need to do to win, and I wouldn't waste resources on abilities to tip these scales. As you transition to the middle game, your focus changes. Now you're looking at contributing more to your guild and guild raids, as well as widening your roster to progress with legendary release events and guild war. You won't have all characters unlocked, but for the mid-game section I'm going to select and recommend characters from Epic and below. You might be lucky and have 1 or 2 legendary characters, but I'm not going to focus on them for ability recommendations here. Generally, the advice I'm going to give you for this stage in the game is to take these characters to gold 1 or so and take their abilities to level 35. Arena is going to be a little bit harder now, and you will often find yourself punching up in fights or against teams that are stronger than you. Rivas has an active ability that works really well in this game mode. You can set her up and she will simply overwatch incoming characters and make your life a lot easier. The active is also useful in legendary release events and guild war, so I think it's a good choice to take to level 35 at least. Legendary events are a way of unlocking new legendary characters. They require you to defeat enemies of progressive difficulty. It's a grindy game mode where you have to work through hordes of enemies, thereby giving more value to healers, summoners, and resilient characters. For legendary release events, the recommendations are as follows. For the Imperials, I would suggest investing in 2 abilities here. Isabella's passive is a godsend and makes her invaluable in this game mode. It heals adjacent characters whenever they're hit, and you can combine her with some tanky characters to cheese through several difficulty levels. The other Imperial ability to invest in is Tangita's passive. Summons are great in this game mode, and being able to create summons every turn, especially ones that are reasonably tanky, is an excellent idea. It helps too that this ability is pretty good for guild raids, as Tangita forms a key component of the mechanical raid team. As a quick side note, healers like Isabella, Rotbone, and their ilk do not measure their ability to heal based on their ability levels. Healing is a measure of the damage stat and the number of hits that a character does. The easiest way to increase the amount they heal through their repeatable heal ability is by simply increasing the character's gear level. Now, let's put these additions onto the summary slide we started earlier for the early game. We're less enthused about spending resources on Aleph Null's active and Bellator's passive just now, so I've grayed them out for this illustration. In addition to the abilities that we have just mentioned, we're going to want to continue working on the abilities we started investing in earlier. Bellator's active should again command some Imperial Badge investment, due to his value in guild raids, campaign, and legendary release events. Eldrion's passive is the one that we will eventually want at level 50, so it makes sense to continue to progress this. Abraxas's active remains excellent for the reasons previously highlighted, and Angrax is our other Chaos investment, simply because he is so good in legendary release events. In the mid game, you also need to start thinking about your raid teams, which ones you want to develop for the late game. Organically, you've already got the shell of the multi-hit team. Generally, my advice to players is to pick another core team to build and add to your multi-hit team. Over-diversifying and building the 3 core teams at once is a recipe for disaster. Generally, picking 2 out of the 3 is the wiser choice. The decision behind which additional team you build will be decided a little bit on how far your guild is progressing every season, and also which bosses you want to do better against. On this screen, I've shown a very simple summary of which teams will do better against which bosses. There are exceptions to this. For example, a super high level mechanical team actually does pretty well even against a level 4 or level 5 Mortarion, but that requires really high level positioning and max stability and gear, so this slide is a generic summary that should apply to about 99% of the player population. The Psyker team is going to be pretty good against Mortarion and the Avatar of Cain, as well as some of the boss primes. The mech team excels against the original Tyranids, namely the Tervigon and Hive Tyrant, as well as the Screamer Killer, Sarek, as well as some of the boss primes. Your multi-hit team is still the best for the rest of the bosses, namely Ghazghkull and Rogel Dorn, while still doing a pretty good job against the original Tyranids and the Screamer Killer. Depending on which additional team you choose, you'll have additional targets for allocation of ability badges. If you chose the Psyker Team, the Neurothroat passive is the most important ability for this team, and is thankfully the only Xenos you require for the entire team. Start feeding some badges in here as you transition to the late game. The other Xenos character that you want to put some investment into is Aethana. Her passive ability increases damage and critical hit chance in a 2-hex aura, and she's a staple particularly against the Rogel Dorn guild raid boss. If you choose the mechanical team, be aware that this team is quite Imperial heavy and will eat up a lot of your Imperial badges, which are stressed and taxed elsewhere as well. Here I would advocate for taking Exeter Rose active and passive to 35. If you have the gold and experience, I would also take Aethana's passive up for the reasons previously highlighted, as she forms a part of the multi-hit team. All said and done, that leaves us with this summary slide for targets at this stage in the game. Under the dotted line are the raid characters and abilities, flexible depending on your choice and approach. Now you're a late game player. By this point in time you've beaten most if not all of the campaigns. You're smashing it in Arena and unlocking legendary release characters without much difficulty. I'll preface this by saying that I don't expect many of you to have characters at this level. It's just to give you some framework to aim for as you enter this stage of the game. The focus in the late game really is to progress your guild raid teams. It's not unreasonable to have a legendary or two unlocked for this stage in the game, but the question that I get asked most often is usually along the lines of this. Nandi, I have these characters unlocked. Who should I focus on next, and what ability level should I take them before moving on to the next character? The reason for this is simple and circles us back to the introduction of the video. Taking an ability from level 35 to 50 costs you 64 legendary badges, 700,000 gold, and about 2.3 million experience. Taking that same ability from level 35 to 44 uses 21 badges, 150,000 gold, and 900,000 experience. In a lot of cases, the gain from 44 to 50 isn't necessarily worth all of that extra investment. So in this section, I've highlighted where to spend your badges, broken down by team. Your investment is going to vary depending on character unlocks and playstyle or team choice, so I've touched on everyone who I think should be important for a late game consideration. You'll notice how Imperial heavy and Chaos light these recommendations are, and that's simply a reality of the fact that the Chaos alliances do not have many good Chaos characters for Guild Raid. There are basically 3 breakpoints here. Level 50, which says that this ability is insane and a cornerstone of what makes the team work. Level 44, which says that the ability is powerful but not essential to max out, particularly if you are a lower spender. And level 36, which says this ability works fine at a lower investment level. If you wanted to put just a few badges and take these abilities to 37 or 38, that would be fine too, but you don't need to go super high with these ones. For the multi-hitter team, these are the recommended breakpoints. Eldrion's passive to 50 and Calgar's passive to 50. Both of these passives are crucial to the multi-hit team doing well and are the only 2 that I recommend maxing out for this multi-hit team. For what it's worth, Eldrion is also often used in the Psyker team as well as the mech team, so his passive to level 50 is the single most important consideration for the late game. Following on Eldrion's passive, Doom, Calgar's passive, Rites of Battle, is probably the second most powerful buffing ability in the game, and to that effect, I'd recommend maxing it out for the multi-hit team, which is reliant on buff effects to do high level damage. On the topic of Calgar, I'd also bring his active up to around level 44. It's pretty great at killing waves of summons in Guild Raid, and also excellent in Arena and Guild War as well. Moving on, I would take Ragnar's active to 44 and Bellator's active to 46. Ragnar is the best damage dealer for the multi-hit team. His active ability increases the bonus damage from Warhowl as it's leveled up, but level 44 is a fine breakpoint. It means that you would need to deal 3000 damage per hit in order to gain an additional 1000 damage through this active ability. You can bring this ability up to level 50 and continue to gain value from it along the way, but there is so much demand for Imperial resources and badges that I think it's reasonable to pause investment at level 44 while you reevaluate the landscape. Bellator's summons help to deal damage in the multi-hit team and are most useful against the original Tyranids and Gazgo, helping you to surround and contain these bosses. This is the one ability that you probably want slightly higher than 44, just so the summons can survive against endgame legendary bosses. Ithana's passive is another one to take up to level 44. It's really good in the multi-hit team, but really excels against Rogel Dorn due to how critical hits work in fighting that boss. I would suggest bringing her passive up to level 44. Moving along to the right, I'd suggest taking Ragnar's passive to 36. His passive ability gives him bonus hits whenever he moves into melee contact with an enemy, and you reach the 3 hit cap once you're at level 36. Bellator's passive, well, we spoke about this earlier, and truth be told, it's fairly low priority in the grand scheme of how many Imperial characters and abilities you want to invest in. I'd stop putting badges in after it gets to level 36, but honestly, I'd see an argument for leaving it off this list entirely. We can touch on the Psyker Team next. This team is a bit more resource light, which is why it's a popular choice for players who are debating on which teams to build up second. The main ability that needs to be maxed out to level 50 is the Neurothroat passive. This is the mainstay of damage for the team composition. We can leave Abraxas' active at level 44 here, as it is mainly used for adding neuroparasite stacks. Higher levels will obviously do more damage and allow your summons to survive in particularly difficult fights. These summons are also great in other game modes like Arena and Legendary Release events, but if you're only looking for guild raid investment, I wouldn't fault you for stopping here. Abraxas' passive adds damage but isn't crucial for the team to perform well, so I've left it off on this must-have recommendations slide. Ahriman and Roswitha both increase the damage dealt by the team through their passive and active abilities respectively. I would suggest taking them to level 44 and 46. Level 46 for Roswitha takes her damage modifier increase to 20% against raid bosses, which is the cap and therefore the natural breakpoint for stopping investing. Finally, the mech team. This is my favourite team at the moment, and high level investment sees them outperform the other teams by a significant margin. Here, Exeter Rowe does almost all of the damage, and you want to take his active and passive ability up as high as you can. After that, I would suggest taking Tangida's passive to 44, so that the summons deal a reasonable amount of damage themselves. Actus's passive is probably the next most important ability, but you can get away with leaving it relatively underleveled at level 36 for the time being. What about Honourable Mentions, characters that don't fit nicely into the above teams? There are 3 Tau on this list. Onshi's active lets you double up on other characters' active abilities. In this context, most often either Bellator or Ragnar. It is useful, but there is no point in over-leveling it, so I would suggest stopping at level 44. Rivas and Sho are sometimes substitutes on the mechanical team, joining the core 3 Adeptus Mechanicus in different situations. Rivas also does a reasonable job in the multi-hit team due to having 9 hits. I would suggest taking both Rivas and Sho's passives to level 36. The main non-raid recommendation here is Angrax. He is amazing in Legendary Release events, and the higher his passive is, the more units he instantly kills on spawn. I would recommend taking his passive ability at least to level 44, possibly even higher, as there aren't many Chaos targets for investment overall. Speaking of Chaos, there's another possible sleeper here in the form of Asgore, the new World Eater. If you haven't checked out my video on him already, I would recommend doing so, where I explain his passive ability in a bit more depth. He is one of the few characters in the ability that has the ability to buff ability damage. I'm therefore cautiously optimistic about his use in things like Legendary Release events, where he can buff Angrax's passive, as well as other Chaos characters like the rumoured Karn the Betrayer. It's not a hard sell, so I'd maybe stop at level 36 for now, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Asgore's stock rise later on, especially as he has so many traits. I've missed out on a lot of characters and abilities in this video, but I've tried to keep this as lean as possible. There are currently just under 80 playable characters in Tacticus, so that's almost 160 abilities to choose from, and that's even before we start thinking about the machines of war. While it may seem like a lot, I've distilled that 160 down to about 24 for you today. It is a long video, but as I'm updating my most popular video ever, I wanted to do it justice. Hopefully you found it useful. If you enjoyed this and my other content, I'd love if you could consider entering my referral code as seen on screen. It earns you 100 Blackstone and supports me in the work that I do. It is single use though, so choose who you support carefully. Bye for now.
Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi.